watching the movie Oppenheimer by Christopher Nolan and listening to politicians from around the world saying the word nuke and how other countries are dangerous because of it, I decided to explore the history of the atomic bomb, possibly one of the most important inventions ever invented by history. Now, the history of the atomic bomb didn't start in 1945 when the US dropped 2 nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It started way back in early 1900s when a scientist named Marie Curie discovered the uses of uranium and what we could use it for. Einstein later developed the theory of relativity, which Einstein eventually developed the theory of relativity, which allowed atoms to be split. Now, other scientists like Niels Bohr and Hindenburg made use of Einstein's discoveries to further the research in quantum physics. Eventually, J. Robert Oppenheimer was around, but he's not important to the story yet. Now, in 1939, there were fears of atomic bomb being developed by Germany. Einstein specifically wrote a letter to President Roosevelt explaining his fears of what Germany could do. In this letter, he urged the president to develop a bomb because he was fearful that Germany might develop a bomb faster than the United States and use it on the rest of the world. Because of this, Franklin D. Roosevelt developed the Manhattan Project, led by J. Robert Oppenheimer. Now, in order to understand the history of the bomb, we have to understand the history of Oppenheimer first. Oppenheimer was an interesting person, to say the least. His wife was possibly a communist. His ex-wife was also possibly a communist. He was possibly a communist. And there was national security concerns that he would leak the bomb to the Soviet Union. But it was eventually discovered that he was a loyal citizen to the United States by a Congress meeting in the 1950s. Now, Oppenheimer created Los Alamos in the middle of New Mexico for the Manhattan Project. There were also other centers, one in Chicago and another one in Tennessee. But Los Alamos was the most important one. There they discovered they needed uranium or plutonium to make the bomb. And they also discovered that they needed graphite to make the bomb. Another reason why Germany couldn't make the bomb was because Hindenburg unexpectedly decided to use heavy water to make the bomb instead of using graphite, which was a major mistake. Now, in 1945, Robert Oppenheimer, along with the US military, tested the first nuclear bomb at Los Alamos. During the testing, there was a fear that the fission created by the bombs would never stop, which would mean that the bomb will light up the atmosphere and eventually destroy the world. But this never happened because the chances of Oppenheimer, as he said before, were near zero. But there was a possibility that this could have happened. So when they dropped the bomb in 1945, that could have possibly been the end of the world. Now, the test was a major success. So the United States decided to drop it on Japan to end the war faster. The bombs were nicknamed Little Boy and Fat Man. Little Boy was made from uranium, while Fat Man was made from plutonium. Now, on August 1945, the bomber B-29 Enola Gray dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima, and when Japan refused to surrender, the next bomb was dropped on Nagasaki a couple of days after. This dropping is very controversial, but at the time, the bombs were seen as a way to end the war faster. If they wanted to end the war, they could have landed troops on Japan, which could have led to 1 million deaths, as calculated by the U.S. military at the time. Or they could have dropped a bomb, which could have led to only a couple 100,000 deaths, mainly by civilians. So at the time, the atomic bomb was the best option. Now, after World War II, the U.S. was the only country that had a monopoly on these bombs. And they thought they were 5 years or even decades ahead of other countries, like the Soviet Union and Great Britain. But in 1948, the Soviets developed their own nuclear bomb, mainly due to personnel from the Manhattan Project coming out and betraying the United States of America. This started a Cold War, or an arms race between the United States and Soviets, as countries raced to develop their own bomb. Eventually, we developed hydrogen bombs. Atomic bombs worked by fission, and the fission, when the atoms would split, it would cause a chain reaction that would cause other atoms to split. But hydrogen bombs use hydrogen to make the process even more deadlier, causing bombs that can reach 50 megatons, causing bombs that can reach 25 or even 50 megatons. Now, to explain how we measure bomb powerfulness, 1 ton of TNT is just 1 ton of TNT. 1 kiloton of TNT is about 1,000 tons of TNT. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons of TNT, which is about 15,000 tons of TNT. But the bombs developed by the Soviet Union and Japan were 50 to 25 megatons, which means that there were 1 million tons of TNT. A megaton is 1 million tons of TNT, which means the bombs developed by the Soviet Union and the United States were 50 million tons of TNT or 30 million tons of TNT, making them infinitely more powerful than what was dropped on Japan in 1945. Now, because of the countries having nukes, many countries were fearful that a new war would end the world as we know it, as a war would be massive. As Albert Einstein said, I know not what weapons may be used in World War III, but I know what weapons will be used in World War IV, sticks and stones, which means that the next war would possibly end humanity as we know it. But that never happened because of a doctrine called MAD, or mutually assured destruction, which would mean that if you launch a nuke at me, I will launch a nuke at you. So I'm gonna be dead, but you're gonna be dead as well. So why launch the bombs in general? So instead of the United States and Soviet Union facing off against each other in a conventional sense, they decided to do proxy wars. If you don't know what proxy wars are, it's basically when two countries sponsor different sides of a conflict in a smaller country like Ethiopia. Most famous examples were the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The South Korean and North Korean governments were both sponsored by different countries. South Korea was the United States, North Korea was the Soviet Union, and the same thing happened in the Vietnam. But what we don't know is that these proxy wars also happen in countries like Ethiopia, Libya, DRC, which are still going on today and causing the deaths of millions of people every year. Now, there have been many examples where we thought the world was going to end. There have been two major examples. The first one was in the Korean War, when the Americans pushed the North Koreans so far that eventually the Chinese joined the war. Now, MacArthur is saying we need to nuke the Chinese because he wanted to win the war. So he's saying we use a nuke to nuke them. But President Truman eventually said no, because that would cause a world war. The second time was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had nuclear bombs on Cuba. Cuba at the time was a communist state sponsored by Fidel Castro, and nobody wants nukes in their backyard. So there was an invasion planned for Cuba, but that failed. It's called a Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, it's kind of complicated, but what happened was the Soviet Union told the United States, if you take your bombs out of Turkey, I will get my bombs out of Cuba. Eventually, the United States took its bomb out of Turkey, and the Soviet Union took their bombs out of Cuba. But the crisis was averted. Now, there have been many other examples where nukes were almost used. But let's just skip to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. This left the United States as the only superpower with bombs, as most of the Soviet Union nukes were in other countries like Ukraine or Kazakhstan. But eventually, Ukraine and Kazakhstan both signed deals that basically said, if you don't attack us, we will give you all of your nukes back. All their nukes back. Ukraine had about 2,000 nukes in their countries, and Kazakhstan had about 4,000 nukes in the countries. But all of them were actually given back to Russia. Now, if you look at the map, this is all the countries that have nuclear weapons. The two biggest ones are United States and Russia, both having about 6,000 each. Most of these bombs that the United States and Russia uses have about 10 megatons of TNT, which means that they have 10 million tons of TNT, which is only about half of what the US and Soviet Union had during the Cold War. Other countries that have nuclear bombs are the UK and France, both having 400 each respectively, China having 300, India and Pakistan having 100, and North Korea, even though they say the most that we would nuke, they only have 50 nuclear bombs. But that's still enough to end most countries. Now, countries that are suspected of having nuclear bombs are Iran and Israel. Israel most likely has nuclear bombs. We do not know for sure, but there's a 90% possibility they have nuclear bombs. Iran, on the other hand, is controversial because, as has said before, Iran possibly has nuclear bombs, but recently the U.S. government has taken action to eliminate Iranian uranium enrichment facilities, which happened in like under Donald Trump's presidency just this year. Just this year. Now, with all this in mind, we learned the destructive capabilities of the atomic bomb, which is why we should never let another war happen. Because if a war does happen in this era of warfare, it will be destructive and it will be nothing like we ever know of.